Αυτό είναι το podcast του Βαγγέλη για τα κινούμενα σχέδια. Του Βαγγέλη του ψευδού και όχι του ψελού της γνωστής βυζαντινής οικογένειας. Και το επεισόδιο αρχίζει τώρα. Greetings everyone, I am Vangelis Karadimas. I am a Greek animator, 2D animator. And this is my podcast slash vidcast I hold about animation, especially Greek animation. This is a special episode since this is one in English language, and I will try to speak as little as possible in order not to ruin it. So I'm happy to announce that with me today is Martin Keady. He's the scriptwriter of Saving Shakespeare, and without further ado, Martin, thank you for being here with me today. You're welcome to this vidcast podcast, and please tell us a few about yourself.
Thank you, Vangelis, for having me. Hello to you and hello to everyone who might be listening or watching. My name is Martin Keady. I am a writer, and among my major works is Saving Shakespeare, a biographical story of Shakespeare, which I've been developing as an animated series or show with Vangelis.
As far as I know, you've dedicated a great part of your life studying Shakespeare, and I'm not talking about only the plays. How did this occur, and what forms did this dedication take?
It's a very good question, and probably the most important question that I should ask myself, Vangelis. I have always been a great lover of Shakespeare, and thinking back specifically, I really first became involved or first read Shakespeare rather when I was about 12 or 13, about the age that most children are introduced to him at school around the world. And in particular, I remember the first time I read Macbeth, which is my favorite play, and I will just say very briefly that I was reading it in a typical English autumnal evening where it was dark when I began reading it, and by the time I finished reading it, I looked up from the page and it was pitch black, and somehow I must have been so gripped by reading the play. I wouldn't have understood it all at that time or at that age, obviously, but it clearly had some effect on me. And I've always cited that as an example of Shakespeare's complete and instant hold over me. I studied Shakespeare at the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon. I've subsequently written about Shakespeare in a wide variety of media, both fiction and non-fiction, and all of that work and research has really culminated in Saving Shakespeare, which I've written as a stage play, a screenplay, which would obviously include animation and other media, and even as what I call a sonic play, an audio, radio, or podcast play. The greatest stories can be told in any medium, I believe, and the story of Shakespeare's own life is one of the greatest stories. And what's remarkable is that there has never been a genuine biopic in the cinema or even a biodrama in the theatre about Shakespeare, telling the full story of his life. It seems an extraordinary omission, but there it is. It's hiding in plain sight, as it were, and it's a gap or a vacuum that I hope to fill with Saving Shakespeare.
So, why is Shakespeare's life interesting? I can say as one who worked on your scripts and as a person who studied history and archaeology, that I found a lot of things that are really interesting, but I guess that it is better to hear it from you.
Well, put very simply, Shakespeare is the greatest dramatist who ever lived, and I believe that his life was as dramatic as anything that he wrote. And it's relatively little known, even among so-called Shakespeareans, even among people I know in the Shakespeare academic and research community. There are remarkable things about his life that I believe directly shaped his writing. As with any writer, it's not a straight cause and effect. It's what happened to Shakespeare in his actual life was then refracted, for want of a better word, diffused or somehow redirected through his own genius. But there is also a direct, or at least an indirect, link to his own life in almost all of his writing. In the story of Saving Shakespeare, I look at three main episodes or turning points in his life, which I believe correspond beautifully to the three main genres in which he wrote: comedy, history, and tragedy. The comedy is the first part of the story, which you know well, having adapted it as a comic or a graphic novel, which is available to read or see on my website, theshakespeareplays.com.
We will
All
put
one
a
word.
link down in the description in YouTube.
Terrific. And it is just theshakespeareplays.com. I always joke that Shakespeare very foolishly didn't copyright or brand his name, so I swept in and stole it for my purposes. The first part of the story is comedy, which is how Shakespeare and his fellow players stole a theatre, a whole theatre, facing eviction by a puritanical landlord who didn't like players or players. They resorted to taking the theatre apart, nail by nail, plank by plank, and transporting it across the frozen River Thames to a new site on the other side of the Thames, the southern side. And that theatre became the Globe, the theatre that we know of today. The second part of the story is history, and it is the remarkable but true story of how Shakespeare and his fellow players became involved, unwittingly or otherwise, in a plot to overthrow the Queen, Elizabeth I. And the final part of the story is tragedy, which is the last 6 months of Shakespeare's life, when he had returned to Stratford-on-Avon, his hometown, and hoping to enjoy a peaceful and well-deserved retirement, he instead became involved into a tragedy of personal and family affairs that I believe contributed to his dying much earlier than he might have done otherwise. Comedy, history, tragedy, Shakespeare's three great genres, and it's almost a saying or a truism that Shakespeare reflects all human existence. Well, what people forget is that his writing reflects his own existence. His own life can be regarded as a Shakespeare play, or more accurately, a series of plays: a comedy, a history, and a tragedy.
What fascinates me, especially in Shakespeare's story, is that if he didn't have those dedicated friends, we would probably not know him at all today. Or at least there would be a chance that we would never heard of him.
Absolutely, or perhaps only partially, if I may say, Vangelis. It is likely that without the help of his friends, who were his fellow players, in particular three, his leading man, Richard Burbage, and the two managers of his company, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, who were also players in addition to being company managers. Essentially, after Shakespeare died prematurely because of the tragic events of the last 6 months of his life, at that point, only half of his plays had ever really been properly printed. That was because at the time, astonishing as it seems now, there was no copyright or intellectual property law, for want of a better term, that applied to plays. If you wrote a play and published it, anyone else could take it and put it on the stage without paying you or even acknowledging you properly. And that was why during his own life, Shakespeare didn't publish most of his plays, it would almost have been financially foolhardy to do so. Had he done so, it would have been much easier for people to pirate his work. But after he died, his friends realized that after the man had died, the work might die soon afterwards as well. And I obviously don't want to give away the whole story, but that is a vital part, an epilogue, as it were, to the whole story. Without his friends, there really wouldn't be the Shakespeare we know today. Only half of his works would have survived, and of those half, only a few of them were ever printed properly. There would have been garbled or even incomprehensible versions, and without the help of his friends, who were so dedicated to him, Shakespeare would be at best half the Shakespeare we know today. He would certainly not be regarded as the transcendent universal genius of all art that he is almost universally regarded as today.
Okay, now let's move to another part. I have to compliment the Greek audience of this
Of
vidcast.
course.
How was Shakespeare related to Greece, or to put it better, because Greece was not a state back then, how was he related to Greeks, ancient or temporarily, as he was, as his time?
Well, in Shakespeare's time, the people of the rest of Europe, especially the more educated part of society, and Shakespeare was, at least initially, among that more educated part of society, they were much more intimately involved with ancient Greece and Rome, the classical world, than we are today, than we could ever imagine of being today. Obviously, the Renaissance, the discovery of printing, or rather the development of printing in Europe, and the discovery of many of the ancient Greek and Roman plays in the century or so before his birth, plays that were then translated into other languages, including English. It gave Shakespeare and other writers of his time this incredible resource that had almost been lost to certainly to Western Europe for the better part of a millennium, for the better part of 1,000 years. He would have studied both Latin and Greek as a schoolboy, and that's absolutely vital to emphasize. His close contemporary and probably the most famous other writer of his period, Ben Jonson, was quoted and has been quoted widely as saying Shakespeare knew little Latin and no Greek. That is almost certainly untrue. Jonson himself was a self-educated man who largely taught himself the works of Rome and Greece, and he may have even subconsciously looked down on Shakespeare or resented the classroom, the school learning that he'd had. But there is no doubt that Shakespeare's, quote, little Latin and no Greek, unquote, would have been probably comparable to that of say, a student studying classics, Greece and Rome, in a university in the 21st century. He would have had this resource to draw on. And Greece is there throughout all of his work and all of his writing. The most obvious example is the many close comparisons between Hamlet, arguably his greatest play, and the Orestes by Aeschylus. Enormous comparisons between the two. A king who kills a king rather who is killed by a relative, the repercussions for the other surviving members, even down to the importance of friends. In many ways, Orestes must have been an influence on Hamlet. In addition, Shakespeare sets plays, two of his plays, in Greece. People know of Timon of Athens. The title is obviously a giveaway, but what people often forget is that A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is often described as the sort of quintessential English play, or the English summertime play, it's often performed in England in summertime, is actually set in Greece. Greece, like Italy, and he wrote plays that were set in Italy, obviously, notably Othello and The Merchant of Venice, they were imaginative spaces for him, imaginative working and playing spaces. They were always there in his imagination. And so the influence of the ancient world, of Rome and Greece, which, as I say, had really only been rediscovered in the century before his birth, they were absolutely vital influences on him, probably the most important influences on him.
Okay, now another question, a bit more personal. I remember I was surprised to get an email from an English fellow asking me if I can animate if I can animate his scripts, and it was you asking me to animate Saving Shakespeare. It is not something common to have a British person to ask a Greek working on an animated series based on his script. What was the issue there? What happened?
Well, in the first instance, Vangelis, it was that you had expressed an interest in my work. You said that you yourself were a lover of Shakespeare, and if you may remember, it goes back a number of years now to that almost long ago, far away mythical world of the pandemic, when we, like many creative people in different areas, contacted, we met online, or met as it were, because we weren't able to meet people physically at the time. You expressed an interest in my work. We initially worked on the idea that we initially worked on, if you remember, was a much broader story. It was called Bedtime Stories by the Greatest Storytellers, which is there in the back pocket, as it were, for the future after Saving Shakespeare. Shakespeare was just one of a number of stories that were literally or half a dozen of the greatest authors who'd ever lived, from Homer to Shakespeare to Jane Austen to Dickens. And the story was, or the setting or the format was, that those great writers would, like any parent, have told their children bedtime stories. And the Shakespeare story that I had him telling his children was the story of how he and his fellow players had stolen a theatre. And so Saving Shakespeare directly evolved and developed from the Bedtime Stories by the Greatest Storytellers series. That was always my greatest interest, and thankfully you were interested in it too, and that's what has led us to working together.
So I don't have any other questions to ask you. Is there something that you would like to add in this conversation?
I would just re-emphasize, if I may, Vangelis, the point I made probably right at the beginning, that remarkable as it sounds, there has never been a single dramatic work that tells the full story of Shakespeare from childhood to death and beyond. There has never been a full biographical play. There has never been a genuine biopic. Shakespeare in Love was terrific, but it was a complete fantasy, and obviously only focused rather on a particular life. It's obviously a bold and ambitious task to try and tell the story of Shakespeare in a single dramatic work. One, if I may say, that is almost worthy of Shakespeare himself. In his absence, or in his given his inability to do so, which was partly because he died prematurely, and B, because at the time he would never have thought or believed that his own story was worth telling. That's what I've set out to do. And as I've also said earlier, I do genuinely believe that the greatest stories can be told in any medium, from a stage to a screen to a podcast to an animated series to a graphic novel. And that's what I'm trying to do. Obviously, we're still trying to develop the animated series. You have very kindly and very ably turned the first part of the story, the comedy story in which they steal a theatre, into the graphic novel, which I repeat is available for people to read or see at my website, theshakespeareplays.com. I'm also working towards a full production of a stage play next year. In my wildest dreams, it would be performed, or at least part of it would be performed at the opening of the new Shakespeare Museum in Shoreditch, East London, which is where Shakespeare was originally based before he moved to the Globe. I'm still in discussions with the Shakespeare Museum and remain hopeful. I also hope to do to produce a sonic version, an audio radio podcast version. It's almost war, or at least a campaign on all fronts. I love this story. I think it's a story that needs to be told, a story that explains why the greatest writer who ever lived became the greatest writer who ever lived. And that's the story that I want to tell.
Okay, so a few words from me now as a conclusion. In a month or so, I will start a crowdfunding campaign in Kickstarter. There will be a link in my web page, vktoons.com. Sending the visitor there. It will be about starting a 2D animation studio here in Athens, Greece. Starting a studio in Greece is something more difficult than doing it in other countries. This, in case I manage to create a studio, I will be able to more easy find funds about my projects, and obviously saving Shakespeare will be among them. And although my main target group are the Greek folks and Greek companies, I would gladly accept backers from British area, and especially since I have in mind do some work on the British history, and especially the ancient history of Britain. I won't say something more now, but anyway, if someone decides to back the campaign, that might help him do it in a more enthusiastic way. I think that I should leave the final word to you now, Martin, to close this session.
Well, literally off the back of what you have just said, Vangelis, I would make this pitch to any potential sponsor or supporter. My ambition is to tell, for the first time ever really in any medium, the story of Shakespeare's remarkable life. For any would-be producer or promoter or sponsor, this is your opportunity to help us tell, for the first time ever, the remarkable true story of undoubtedly the greatest writer who ever lived, arguably the greatest artist in any medium who ever lived, and quite possibly the greatest human being who ever lived. And I hope that would be a source of interest, if not compulsion, for any potential sponsors or supporters.
Once again, thank you for this conversation, Martin. And I would also like to help everyone who watched this podcast / vidcast. And I will see you soon in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Vangelis, and bye-bye to you and everyone.
Ήταν ζάχαρη και μέλι αυτό το podcast του Βαγγέλη. Περιμένουμε τη γνώμη σας στα σχόλια μαζί με τις ερωτήσεις σας. Νέο ραντεβού περίπου σε 2 εβδομάδες.